What would you think if a frontier doctor uncovered a row of graves, 11 in total, each too small for an adult, each identical, each arranged with the precision of a ledger? Were these the tragic losses of a family at the edge of survival, or the careful evidence of something far darker? In the winter of 1876, deep in the Montana Territory, Dr. Theodore Brennan stumbled upon a discovery that would follow him for the rest of his life. Behind a remote cabin lay a cemetery of children, and beneath its floorboards, journals wrapped in oiled cloth. What those pages contained was not grief, but calculation. Generations of births recorded, defects listed, and infants marked for what the family called release. The Donnelly family had come from Ireland with forged papers and sacks of gold, claiming to be ordinary farmers. But their lives in America concealed a legacy that began nearly a century earlier, when one man in County Cork decided that bloodlines could be purified like cattle. From those beliefs grew a hidden experiment. 5 generations of selective breeding, infanticide, and secrets carried across the ocean into the silence of Montana's valleys. Tonight, we follow that story, from famine-haunted Ireland to the hidden homestead, through births that ended in ritual burial, and into the pages of journals that reveal just how far one family went in their pursuit of bloodline purity. Before we begin, welcome to Gothic Ledger, where we unearth the darkest corners of history and the secrets that institutions tried to bury. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive. Remember to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next descent into forgotten history. In the winter of 1876, Dr. Theodore Brennan found a cemetery too small for adults and too neat to be an accident. The snow lay heavy in the valley, muffling sound and pressing the world into silence, yet the shapes at the cabin's rear betrayed a disturbance that nature had not authored. 11 wooden crosses, each precisely the same height, stood in rows along the frozen ground. Their symmetry carried no trace of grief. They suggested preparation, design, and the deliberate management of loss. The graves themselves told a story no mourning parent would ever wish to write. The earth was turned in rectangular plots too shallow for grown bodies, and the spacing between each suggested careful foresight, as if room had been left for more. The crosses bore crude marks, dates only, etched with the same practiced hand, months apart, but with an order too consistent to be chance. Brennan knew the rhythm of epidemic burials, of households struck by sudden sickness, and these were not that. Here the soil had been disturbed at intervals like entries in a ledger, each burial a notation in some ongoing calculation. The physician's eyes lingered on the frost-bitten earth, where winter had sealed the ground, yet still revealed the uneven compression of hurried work. The snow lay thinner there, as if the heat of fresh decay had struggled against the season. To Brennan's trained perception, the scene radiated not sorrow, but procedure. These were not the desperate graves of infants lost to harsh wilderness. They were the controlled outcomes of a practice repeated until ritual itself had become indistinguishable from routine. Inside the cabin, the evidence deepened. Beneath the warped floorboards, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth against rot, he uncovered the journals. At first glance, they resembled commonplace ledgers, the kind used by merchants or surveyors, but their contents revealed another purpose. Page upon page bore anatomical sketches of infants, spines bent, skulls misshapen, limbs truncated. Each drawing was annotated in both Gaelic and English, with dates, brief descriptions, and words that echoed livestock assessment rather than human parentage. Fit, weak, imperfect, release. The precision unsettled more than the drawings themselves, for the handwriting was steady, consistent, and untroubled by hesitation. The inked figures were accompanied by genealogical diagrams, branches folded back upon themselves, marriages drawn between cousins, a bloodline enclosed like a loop that refused new input. Notes in the margins spoke of purity preserved and weakness excised. Brennan traced his finger across the pages, recognizing the language of selection, words he had seen in breeding manuals of cattle and horses, but now transposed upon children. The oiled cloth had preserved these journals for decades. Their paper carried the faint scent of smoke and tallow, as if they had been opened during births and closed again in the presence of death. The silence of the room pressed upon him. Outside, the neat crosses seemed to stand guard over the house, mute witnesses to what had been carried out within. Inside, the journals whispered of a system perfected long before Montana. Brennan realized he was not looking at tragedy, but continuity, a program imported, practiced, and maintained across generations. The graves aligned in winter light, the journals sealed beneath wood, and the hush of the valley formed a tableau of methodical horror. This was no frontier accident. It was evidence of a design older than the land that concealed it, a practice refined until even death itself appeared orderly. Montana was where the law ended, and families could vanish for years without anyone asking why. In the 1870s, the territory remained more wilderness than settlement, a vast expanse carved by mountains, rivers, and silence. Helena, declared the capital in 1875, was little more than a mining camp with pretensions, its streets lined with rough saloons, hastily built hotels, and warehouses serving men whose fortunes rose and collapsed in the dust of abandoned claims. Fewer than 8,000 souls lived there, clustered like an outpost of fragile order at the threshold of endless dark terrain. Beyond its borders, authority thinned to a whisper. The roads were not roads at all, but crude trails that buckled beneath snow in winter and dissolved into mud each spring. Mail carriers risked their lives to make monthly runs, their paths crossing gulches where a single storm could wipe away all evidence of passage. Deputies sent from Helena patrolled when weather permitted, but their reach extended no further than a day's ride. In the valleys between ranges, entire homesteads could exist without registry, their occupants unknown to any office, their deeds unrecorded. Land was plentiful and cheap because no one in Washington cared to measure it carefully. In such conditions, secrecy was not a burden, it was a natural state. The gold rush that had once promised prosperity was already waning. Mines that had drawn thousands to Helena and Virginia City collapsed into silence, leaving behind men desperate enough to linger on the margins. Many turned to trapping, scavenging, or theft. Others vanished into the hills to begin lives under false names. The land swallowed them, offering no judgment and no witness. Families could claim valleys so remote that smoke from a chimney might never be seen by neighbors for months, even years. Isolation was protection, but also transformation. It warped the human mind, bending it inward until customs that would have been unthinkable in towns became permissible, then routine. Medical care scarcely existed. The few physicians stationed in Helena were army surgeons, skilled at amputations and gunshot wounds, but not at birth defects or fevers that carried through cabins. In mining camps, remedies came in bottles of whiskey or patent medicine. On the frontier, survival depended on self-reliance, and secrecy was a close companion to self-reliance. The farther one lived from town, the less one had to answer to anyone. Montana's winters ensured silence as much as distance. From November to March, mountain passes closed under snow, leaving valleys sealed like crypts. Families endured 6 months of darkness, with only their own voices to fill the void. Cabin walls absorbed the weight of arguments, prayers, or screams, and by spring no outsider could say what had taken place there. Death was common, but accountability was rare. A burial could be hidden beneath drifts until thaw, by which time even questions seemed useless. This was the landscape into which the Donnellys arrived, a territory where concealment was easier than confession. The mountains themselves seemed designed for secrets, their slopes casting shadows that concealed cabins and graves alike. In Montana, law could not reach every hollow, nor did it try. Here, bloodlines could continue unchecked, rituals could persist unobserved, and families could remake themselves according to codes no court would recognize. The land did not resist them, it permitted. And so, in the deep valleys where no deputy rode, secrecy did not merely survive, it thrived. They came with gold, forged papers, and a story that fit too neatly. In September of 1874, Patrick Donnelly guided a freight wagon into Helena, its wheels creaking under the weight of wooden crates bound in rope. With him came his wife, Bridge, and their 4 surviving children, Seamus, 19, Moira, 17, Colleen, 15, and young Declan, scarcely 12. They presented themselves as Irish peasants fleeing the long shadow of famine, claiming they had farmed in Brooklyn before venturing west. The story was plausible enough to pass with casual listeners, yet every detail carried an unease that lingered in the minds of those who met them. Patrick stood taller than most settlers, his posture erect, his clothes well kept despite the rigors of the trail. He introduced himself as a farmer, yet his hands betrayed him. There were no calluses thickened by years of labor, no cracked nails or sun-scoured skin. Instead, his fingers bore faint stains of ink, the kind left by ledgers or correspondence. His voice carried the lilt of education, precise and deliberate, touched by an accent of County Cork, yet smoothed by schooling uncommon among his class. He spoke easily of land and crops, but never with the detail of one who had spent decades coaxing food from reluctant soil. Bridge Donnelly cut a contrasting figure, slight, prematurely lined, her eyes fixed as if on scenes others could not see. She kept her children close, always within reach, her gestures protective to the point of obsession. Shopkeepers in Helena remarked on her behavior with unease. She handled gold coins with trembling precision, counting each piece repeatedly before releasing it with visible reluctance. She paid in coin exclusively, no credit, no barter, though the source of such wealth was never explained. The children unsettled neighbors most of all. Their resemblance to one another went beyond family likeness. Each bore the same pale blue eyes, elongated fingers and narrow features, as if cast from the same mold. They were disciplined, their movements careful and rehearsed. When spoken to, they answered with respect, but never warmth, as though strangers posed not opportunity but threat. To watch them together was to observe a unit rather than individuals, their interactions marked by an unnatural symmetry that suggested training, not chance. Their arrival was cloaked in official papers, deeds, residency affidavits, and employment records from Brooklyn. All appeared genuine, their ink fresh, their signatures intact. Yet the documents were too perfect. They lacked the usual scrawls and inconsistencies common in such files. Only a practiced forger, or someone with knowledge of clerical archives, could have produced them. Helena's officials, accustomed to settlers arriving with little more than word of mouth, accepted them without question. Few cared to scrutinize too closely. Still, whispers began to circulate. Why would famine-worn farmers arrive with crates heavy enough to strain a freight wagon, their contents never revealed? Why did Patrick avoid the camaraderie of other Irish immigrants, keeping his family apart as though too fragile for mingling? And why did their carefully rehearsed story always return to Brooklyn, a city where no one in Helena had kin to confirm or deny their claims? The Donnellys settled quickly, but not comfortably. Their lives were staged with precision, their words measured, their wealth unexplained. In a town where desperation was visible in every face, their perfection drew suspicion rather than trust. Helena had seen many families arrive seeking fortune, but the Donnellys had not come to be found. They had come to disappear. The family fled not famine, but a priest's threat: leave now or face exposure. In County Cork, Ireland, their departure had been whispered about in tones of dread rather than sympathy, for what drove them westward was not poverty, but scandal, one so grave that the parish itself recoiled. The year was not long past the famine's shadow, when fields lay scarred and villages hollowed by starvation. In that landscape of want, Father Michael O'Sullivan was a figure of steadiness, a parish priest known for discretion, a shepherd to flocks that had endured hunger, eviction, and grief. He had heard confessions of theft, blasphemy, and violence, yet what he uncovered in the Donnelly household shook him beyond even his seasoned tolerance. Records survive only in fragments: letters to his bishop, the draft of an excommunication never delivered, and a single private journal entry. Together, they sketch the outline of something the priest could scarcely name. He wrote of a household where the marriage bed is not kept pure, where cousins became spouses and children bore too close a resemblance to one another. He noted baptisms he refused to conduct, infants born with deformities that vanished before they could be blessed, and a lineage that seemed to fold in upon itself with each generation. O'Sullivan confronted Patrick Donnelly directly, his hand shaking as he recorded the words. "What you have done in the name of bloodline purity is a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Leave this parish immediately, or I will ensure that every soul in Cork knows the true nature of your abominations." The warning carried both spiritual and temporal weight. To be named from the pulpit as an abomination was to be cast out not only from church, but from village life itself. For the Donnellys, the threat was more than moral. It was survival. The secrecy of their practices, arranged cousin Maris, ages, quiet disposal of unfit infants, whispered doctrines of purification, could not endure exposure in a land where famine had already made the fragile community cling to its church as its last pillar of order. Discovery meant ruin. Within weeks the family sold what property they could, gathered their gold, and vanished. The echoes of 1798, when rebellion and hunger had driven Irish families to desperate measures, seemed to resurface in their doctrine. The journals later uncovered in Montana referenced Fergus Donnelly, the patriarch, who first articulated the idea that Irish blood, degraded by centuries of British oppression, could be restored through deliberate selection. He had spoken of cattle breeding in the same breath as Scripture, of Abraham's genealogies as proof that close unions purified rather than corrupted. From him descended not just children, but a philosophy, that weakness was sin, and that blood could be shaped as surely as soil could be tilled. Father O'Sullivan, though remembered locally as stern but compassionate, confessed in his own private note that he felt fear in their presence. "They speak of mercy while preparing murder," he wrote. "I have heard the language of Scripture twisted to sanctify death. If they remain, the parish itself will bear the curse." The Donnellys obeyed his ultimatum. They fled with forged papers that placed them in Brooklyn, though in truth they sailed directly for America under assumed names. Their neighbours, left behind in Cork, told stories in hushed voices that the family had not left to escape famine, but to escape judgment. And so their exile began not as a passage to survival, but as a continuation of a practice already generations deep. Ireland had marked them, but not ended them. The mountains of Montana would give them the silence their priest had denied. The cabin was not a home, it was a fortress for secrets. Set in a narrow Montana valley where ridges rose steeply on both sides, the Donnelly homestead was built less for comfort than concealment. From the nearest trail, no smoke could be seen, no lantern light glimpsed. Only those who stumbled directly upon the clearing would ever know a family lived there, and even then, the design of the dwelling suggested not welcome, but defense. Patrick and his sons constructed the cabin with an efficiency that startled neighbors accustomed to crude log shacks. The walls were hewn from thick timber, joined with unusual precision, the seams packed so tightly that drafts found no entry. Windows were few, each narrow, their shutters reinforced from within, reducing both heat loss and the risk of prying eyes. A complex partition of inner walls divided the cabin into compartments far smaller than necessary, corridors of wood and cloth curtains designed to separate spaces, to hide movement, to muffle sound. Privacy seemed absolute, yet privacy was not the purpose. It was containment. The interior was equally methodical. Rations were stacked and measured with mathematical care. Rows of preserved meat wrapped in waxed cloth, jars of root vegetables brined against decay, shelves of dried grains sorted into labelled sacks. Unlike most settlers, who stored haphazardly and lived from week to week, the Donnellys had created a system, an arithmetic of survival that allowed them to vanish into winter with no need for trade or contact. Every act of preservation, every sealed jar and measured sack, suggested an intention to endure not just nature, but scrutiny. Even water was managed with forethought. A spring-fed creek flowed only in summer, freezing solid by October. Yet the family had constructed channels to divert and capture what they needed before the freeze, storing it in covered cisterns. Livestock pens were built against the cabin itself, their walls double-layered to keep warmth from escaping, the animals' heat seeping back through the timbers. These measures were beyond what poor Irish farmers were expected to know. They revealed either previous experience with extreme climates or instructions studied before arrival. It was not merely efficiency, but strategy. The homestead looked less like a farmstead and more like an installation, a place designed to function independently of the outside world, able to sustain secrecy for months at a time. Winter, which drove other families to desperation, became their ally. From November to March the passes closed, snow sealing the valley as if by intention, and the Donnellys disappeared into silence. When they returned in spring, they re-emerged intact, their household as untouched as if the wilderness itself conspired to shield them. To the casual eye, the cabin seemed proof of discipline and resilience. But to Brennan, and later to those who studied his notes, the structure revealed a darker purpose. The partitions, the rationing systems, the concealment, all pointed to an awareness that what transpired inside was not meant for neighbors or lawmen to see. The cabin had been engineered not to shelter a family, but to safeguard a practice. The valley's remoteness, the cabin's design, and the family's self-sufficiency formed together a fortress, silent, methodical, impenetrable. A place where a lineage could continue unchecked, hidden behind walls thick enough to contain both sound and sin. The infant cried weakly, but the family looked on as if they had seen it all before. It was March of 1875 when the mountain passes finally opened after 6 months of snowbound silence. Jake Harrison, the territorial mail carrier, had ridden hard through thawing drifts to deliver government correspondence. What he found in the Donnelly cabin was not the eager relief of settlers welcoming spring, but a scene carried out with the stillness of ritual. Bridge Donnelly lay in labor, her body exhausted, her voice hoarse from strain. At her side, her daughter Moira, still a teenager, attended to the birth with the efficiency of a practiced nurse. Harrison, accustomed to frontier hardship, expected panic, prayers, or desperate calls for aid. Instead, he saw only a household moving with calm precision, each role rehearsed as though this trial had been faced many times before. The child that emerged bore marks of misfortune so clear that even an untrained eye would recognize them. Its spine curved in a cruel S, its left arm twisted into a clubbed hand with only 3 fingers, its head heavy and disproportionate to its body. The cries that came were thin and muffled, more mule than wail, the sound of lungs fighting against malformed structure. Yet there was life in it still, struggling, insistent. Harrison, shocked by the sight, offered to ride back through thaw and mud to fetch a doctor from Helena. His words came quick, urging them to give the child a chance. But Patrick Donnelly silenced him with a glance that carried both authority and finality. "We know how to handle our own troubles," he said in English, though the family had already exchanged words in rapid Gaelic. His tone was not of grief but of assessment, the judgment of a man considering whether a crop would take root. The others stood without protest. Seamus, the eldest son, flinched but made no move to intervene. Declan, Anne, the youngest, lingered at the doorway, his face pale with something like dread, yet his silence was absolute. Bridge, drained and trembling, did not weep. Her gaze rested on the child, not with sorrow, but with resignation. "The mountain air is too harsh for one so delicate," Patrick continued, his voice stripped of feeling. "It's God's mercy, really. Better to take them young than let them suffer." The infant's cries filled the room, then dwindled, as if smothered by the heavy air itself. Harrison felt the walls pressing in, the fire's heat too close, the silence too calculated. He understood then that his presence was unwelcome, that the Donnelly household required no witness. When he returned 2 weeks later, the child was gone. Bridge met him at the door, her eyes red but dry, her body already withdrawn into routine. "Lost the baby 3 days after you left," she said, her voice flat. "Buried him behind the cabin next to the others." It was the phrase that chilled Harrison most. Next to the others. Behind the cabin, 4 small crosses stood in a row, their soil fresh, their spacing exact. Not graves of sudden tragedy, but of the system, each prepared in advance, waiting for the inevitable. There was no grief here, only procedure. The ground behind the cabin was turned with a pattern too orderly for grief. Jake Harrison had seen many frontier burials, hastily dug mounds, stones piled against the wind, crude markers carved with whatever tools were at hand. They carried the irregularity of desperation. Graves placed where earth yielded most easily, each one shaped by circumstance rather than design. But what stood behind the Donnelly cabin was different. It was a cemetery arranged as if drawn on paper before the first spade had touched the soil. 4 small graves lay in a row, each marked with a wooden cross, cut from the same timber, shaved to the same height, etched with dates only months apart. Their proportions were identical, their spacing exact, the earth disturbed with a symmetry that denied the chaos of death. It was not the mark of mourning, but of intention. The soil itself spoke of haste. The frozen ground had been broken by heavy tools, its surface uneven, clods piled in ways that betrayed efficiency over care. Harrison noted how the disturbed earth remained shallow, the mounds slight, as though effort had been measured against necessity rather than love. The crosses, too, seemed prepared in batches, each cut from the same grain, each angled by the same hand. There was no individuality, no gesture of remembrance, only repetition. The pattern unsettled him more than the deaths themselves. On the frontier, infant mortality was tragically common, but here the intervals between burials formed a rhythm, a progression too precise to be accidental. August, October, December, March. The graves were not random misfortunes, but steps in a sequence. Harrison felt as though he was standing before the ledger of a bookkeeper, each death entered neatly in its place. The family's behavior offered no relief. When he asked about the graves, Patrick Donnelly answered with a rehearsed solemnity, repeating "The weak do not survive the winters." Bridget's eyes lowered, but her silence carried more resignation than grief. The children did not speak of the dead at all. Declan, the youngest, once let slip that father makes the crosses before the baby comes, then caught himself, clapping a hand over his mouth as though he had revealed something forbidden. It was then Harrison realized the burials were not responses to tragedy. They were expectations. Each grave had been prepared not after a child's death, but in anticipation of it. The Donnellys did not wait for nature to decide. They imposed their own order. The row of crosses behind the cabin grew to symbolize something far greater than loss. It was a declaration of belief that only the fit deserved to remain, that weakness carried no right to life, that the family's continuity mattered more than its children. What others would call cruelty, the Donnellys named necessity. In the stillness of that valley, the small cemetery became the truest record of their household. More than the cabin's walls, more than their measured words in town, the graves spoke plainly. They revealed a practice as ritualized as any liturgy, the systematic culling of their own blood, carried out with such precision that sorrow had no place within it. Harrison rode away that spring, with the image burned into his memory, 4 crosses evenly spaced, waiting like the first entries in a book destined to be filled. At night came the crying, then silence, and a singing that wasn't quite human. Jake Harrison, whose roots through Montana's wilderness had made him witness to every form of hardship, began to notice things at the Donnelly homestead that resisted ordinary explanation. These were not the familiar sounds of frontier survival, axes on timber, livestock in distress, the muffled quarrels of families driven to strain. What he heard instead during the long winter of 1875 was something colder, patterned, and deliberate. From the ridges above the valley, light could be seen flickering at hours when every other cabin lay dark, fuel carefully hoarded against the season's cruelty. Yet the Donnelly cabin glowed well past midnight, flames bright enough to cast shifting patterns against snowdrifts. Smoke rose at irregular hours, heavy and pungent, not the steady burn of hearth fires, but surges of heat that spoke of something fed too fast or too often. Harrison made note of this, aware that no prudent settler would waste wood or oil when supply trains stood months away. The sounds unsettled him more. On still nights when the wind quieted, he swore he could hear the thin cries of infants carried across the frozen air. The wailing would rise steadily, then end at once, like a string cut short. Not fading, not weakening, stopping. Each time it did, silence returned so completely that the land itself seemed to hold its breath. To a man who had buried children of his own, the absence felt unnatural. Worse still was the singing. It came faintly, never in full voice, carried in fragments that reached his ear while he camped on the trail. The melody faltered, neither hymn nor lullaby, but a tune that seemed constructed for voices shaped differently than his own. It shifted between Gaelic phrases and sounds that were not words at all, syllables bent as if testing the limits of human throat and tongue. Harrison described it later as music meant for mouths that had forgotten how to form it. Once, in the midst of a snowstorm, he glimpsed figures outside the Donnelly cabin. Through veils of drifting white, shapes moved against the glow of firelight, tall, gaunt, their steps unsteady yet purposeful. They did not walk like farmers bracing against wind, but with jerking motions that seemed practiced, ritualized. One figure lingered too long at the edge of the trees, its posture wrong, shoulders too sloped, its stance held as though bones bent beneath skin were not arranged as they should be. When Harrison looked again, it was gone, swallowed by the storm. He told no one in Helena. To speak of such things was to invite laughter, or worse, suspicion of drunkenness. Yet he recorded his observations in his own notes, careful to separate what could be confirmed from what could only be guessed. lights when fuel should have been scarce, cries that ended without cause, singing unsuited to human cadence, figures glimpsed where none should stand. There was nothing supernatural in what he described, no violation of natural law, and yet it was uncanny, precisely because it was human, human voices, human shapes, human choices bent until they no longer resembled what they once were. The snow concealed much, but sound carried in the cold. What Harrison heard around that cabin was not ordinary hardship. It was practice, it was ritual, and it was deliberate. The family's papers unraveled as easily as the graves they left behind. While the mountain passes lay frozen, Dr. Theodore Brennan turned to records. With travel impossible, his practice in Helena was reduced to treating minors' coughs and the fevers of children. But the troubling reports from mail carrier Harrison lingered in his thoughts. If the Donnellys were what they claimed, farmers from Brooklyn fleeing hardship, then traces of them should exist in the archives of church and port. What Brennan found instead was a pattern of absence and deception. Their immigration documents spoke of 3 years in New York. The papers were thorough, bearing the notations of employers, addresses, and parish attendants. Yet every attempt at verification collapsed. The listed street in Brooklyn contained no record of Donnellys ever residing there. The names of supposed neighbors were inventions drawn from no parish roll. Even the priest who had signed their baptismal attestations could not be located in diocesan registers. The documents were not carelessly made. They were forged with the precision of someone who understood the machinery of bureaucracy, a counterfeit so exact that only the absence of corroboration revealed its fraud. More troubling still were the medical reports Brennan uncovered from Ellis Island. In July 1874, a family named Donnelly had been flagged for examination by Dr. Samuel Morrison, an inspector charged with screening immigrants for disease and abnormality. His notes described children with peculiar elongation of digits, facial symmetry unnaturally uniform, and a suspicious silence when questioned. He warned of possible hereditary affliction and recommended detainment for further study. But the family was released within days. Morrison's protest, buried beneath piles of paperwork, was overruled by administrators eager to clear the endless queues of familles ni emigrants. The paper trail did not end there. Brennan discovered other Donnellys in scattered states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, families that appeared suddenly, stayed only a short time, and then vanished as quickly as they came. In Pennsylvania, county records noted a Donnelly household investigated for unusual numbers of infant deaths. In Ohio, one branch drew suspicion for neglect after 3 infants were buried in a single year, though no charges followed. Each family left behind whispers of abnormality, always accompanied by the same unsettling detail. Children who resembled one another too closely, with faces that seemed duplicated rather than merely related. Wealth posed another unanswered question. Patrick Donnelly had purchased land in Montana with heavy sacks of gold coin. Yet his papers claimed descent from tenant farmers of County Cork, families broken by the famine, their livelihoods reduced to tatters. Farmers did not arrive with such currency. Miners, perhaps. Speculators, certainly. But Patrick bore no calluses of a digger, no tales of prospecting ventures. The gold seemed as carefully obscured as the forged documents that concealed their path from Ireland. Piece by piece, Brennan assembled the fragments into a troubling picture. This was no single household gone astray. It was a network, scattered across 2 continents, each branch practicing the same secrecy, the same selective silences, the same pattern of infant mortality, explained away as chance. The Donnelly family of Montana was only one manifestation of something larger, older, and more deliberate. The graves in the valley were not isolated. They were echoes of graves elsewhere, hidden in Pennsylvania soil, in Ohio fields, in Irish parishes, where baptismal records had gaps too wide to be accidental. What emerged from the archives was not the image of a family fleeing misfortune, it was the outline of a lineage in motion, carrying with it a doctrine older than the voyage, sharper than poverty, and far darker than mere survival. Inside, every wall concealed more than it revealed. When the thaw of spring allowed passage, Dr. Theodore Brennan made his way into the Donnelly Valley under the pretense of offering routine medical service to an isolated frontier family. The cabin stood orderly against the slope, its timbers straight, its roof sound. From the outside, it suggested industry and resilience. But the moment Brennan crossed the threshold, the air shifted. What appeared neat from without proved suffocating within. The first thing he noted was the division of space. The single-room cabins common to frontier life gave way here to a structure partitioned by heavy curtains and panelled walls, narrowing the interior into compartments. Each section was smaller than necessary, sealed from the others with latches and fabric that muffled sound. Movement was obscured, sight lines deliberately broken. It was a house designed to fragment itself, to contain rather than to welcome. Even voices carried differently, dampened, stifled, as if reluctant to travel too far. The air was dense with smells. Not the familiar odours of wood smoke, livestock and stew, but sharper notes. The acrid sting of old medicines, the sweetness of spoiled meat, the faint metallic tang that clings to blood. Somewhere beneath it all was the smell of damp cloth, as though things had been wrapped and hidden, preserved against discovery. To Brennan's trained senses, the mixture was unmistakable, a house where bodies had been handled, not only nourished. Bridge Donnelly met him in the central room, her appearance confirming Harrison's earlier accounts. She had withered into a figure scarcely recognizable as the woman who had arrived in Helena 2 years prior. Her frame was skeletal, her hands trembling without cease. Her hair, streaked grey at the temples, fell untended around her face. She spoke little, and when she did, her husband Silim ensed her with the flick of a glance. The effect was immediate. Her words choked back, her lips tightening, her eyes lowered to the floor. Years of suppression had made obedience reflex. The children, too, bore marks of silence. Moira and Colleen moved about the cabin with an efficiency beyond their years, each gesture measured, each glance to their father quick and anxious. Their eyes, pale and uniform, carried a look of exhaustion out of place in youth. Seamus, the eldest son, stammered when spoken to, his speech breaking apart until he lapsed into mute nods. Declan, the youngest, stared too long at his visitors, his expression unreadable, his body bent slightly as though his frame resisted its own growth. Brennan observed all of this clinically. The children's features suggested a narrowing of inheritance, their bodies showing both unusual symmetry and disturbing defects. Their behavior spoke of a household where fear governed more strictly than affection. The house itself reinforced the impression. Each partitioned space might conceal another child, another practice, another silence. Every curtain, every latch, seemed an act of erasure, a way to keep one member from witnessing what occurred with another. What disturbed him most was not what he saw, but what he could not. From behind one closed partition came a sound faint and rhythmic, something like the rocking of a cradle, though no child was presented. The smell from that quarter carried the rancid sweetness of decay. No explanation was offered, and none could be asked without risk of closing the door forever. In Brennan's notes, he would later describe the house not as a dwelling, but as a device, an apparatus engineered to shield its occupants from the gaze of outsiders and from one another, a structure built not to shelter life, but to conceal what was done to it. The cabin, he concluded, was not a home at a Bilmabiramish. It was a vault. Her condition revealed a truth too disturbing to speak aloud. When Dr. Brennan returned to the Donnelly cabin later that summer, his eyes were drawn at once to Moira, the eldest daughter. At 18, she carried herself with a maturity unusual for her age, but her body now bore unmistakable evidence of pregnancy. The curve of her abdomen was visible beneath her dress, her movements slower, her breaths deeper. It was not the ambiguous swelling of illness, nor the temporary fullness of malnutrition. It was the steady, undeniable shape of new life. The realization settled upon Brennan with a heaviness he had anticipated but hoped not to confirm. The family had been sealed in their valley through the long winter, the passes impassable from November to March. No outsider had crossed their threshold. The isolation was complete, total. Whoever fathered the child, it could only have been one of the family within. Brennan observed the way the household moved around Moira. Her mother, Bridge, watched her constantly, her expression an exhausted mixture of pride and dread. Patrick's gaze was colder, evaluating, proprietary, the eyes of a man regarding not a daughter but an asset. The brothers spoke little, but their silence was weighted, each one glancing at her condition with the furtive acknowledgement of participants in a pact unspoken. Colleen, the younger sister, hovered at Moira's side, her attention protective, yet her eyes betrayed knowledge of inevitabilities that had not yet reached her own body. The cabin itself reflected the state of affairs. One of the inner rooms, partitioned and sealed with cloth, now contained supplies arranged for birth: clean rags, preserved herbs, jars labelled in careful script. There was no attempt to disguise preparation. On the contrary, the arrangement suggested experience. The family had planned for this outcome, as though repetition had murdered it routine. Moira herself spoke little in Brennan's presence. When addressed, she lowered her eyes, her words measured and formal. Her hands rested often on her abdomen, not with joy, but with resignation. She moved with the air of one fulfilling a role long impressed upon her, a role she had not chosen but could not refuse. Her silence said more than words could have. Brennan did not voice the conclusion forming in his mind. To speak it aloud in that cabin would have been to invite confrontation for which he was unprepared. But in his notes he wrote with clinical precision. Conception must have occurred during the sealed months. No outside agency possible. Therefore, paternity confined to father or brothers. Evidence suggests deliberate breeding within the line. The weight of that line bore heavily on him. This was no accident of circumstance, no frontier desperation. It was the continuation of a principle, a doctrine of bloodline purity that had now turned fully inward. Where once cousins were paired, now daughters were drawn into the cycle. The experiment had entered its next stage, abandoning pretense of ordinary union. What disturbed Brennan most was the absence of shame. The family moved as though nothing unnatural had transpired. Moira's pregnancy was acknowledged, but never explained. It was accepted as fact, the way one accepts a season or a harvest. Even in silence, their acceptance was absolute. In that valley, isolation had become more than physical. It had become moral. The walls of the cabin contained not only bodies, but the collapse of every boundary that once defined kinship. And so Brennan understood. The Donnelly bloodline had ceased to be family in any ordinary sense. It had become a closed circuit, breeding only with itself, pursuing its own distorted vision of strength. A vision that demanded daughters become mothers and sons become fathers to their own sisters. It was no longer secrecy alone that sustained them. It was inevitability. They lived 3 days, breathing each other's air. It was July of 1876 when Dr. Brennan was summoned urgently to the Donnelly cabin. The message carried by a trapper was brief and clumsy, but the request itself was unprecedented. The family that had refused all outside help was now calling for a physician. When Brennan entered the partitioned back room, he found Moira in the throes of a labor already far advanced. The air was heavy with sweat, blood, and the faintly sweet odor of decay that seemed to cling perpetually to that house. What emerged from her body was no ordinary child, but two, conjoined at the chest, fused by organs and bone in ways that defied survival. Their torsos shared a single sternum, and the faint rise and fall of their small bodies suggested one circulatory system struggling to sustain two fragile lives. One twin appeared stronger, its cries piercing through shallow, while the other whimpered faintly, its lips blue, its chest heaving irregularly as if it borrowed each breath. Brennan examined them with clinical precision. Separation was impossible. The primitive tools of the frontier could not begin to address the intricacies of fused hearts, shared lungs, and the delicate architecture of what should have been two distinct bodies. Even in the most advanced hospitals of Europe, success would have been doubtful. Here, in an isolated cabin, it was inconceivable. Yet the twins clung to life, their shared chest rising and falling, their arms moving in weak, asynchronous motions. The family's reaction was chilling in its composure. Patrick stood at the bedside, his face expressionless, his hands folded as though awaiting a verdict. Bridge, hollow-eyed, looked on with neither panic nor prayer, her expression the practiced calm of one who had endured this before. Seamus and Colleen moved silently, setting out cloths, preparing vessels, their motions deliberate, irate, efficient, unflinching. No gasp, no cry of anguish broke the air. To them, the sight of malformed offspring was not catastrophe, but continuation. Only Declan, the youngest, betrayed distress. His eyes fixed on the twins with horror and fascination, his lips trembling as if words might escape. But at Patrick's glance he fell silent, his small body stiffening into obedience. For Brennan the moment was unbearable. His oath as physician demanded preservation, yet every instinct told him the infant's struggle could not end in survival. He provided what comfort he could, wrapping the twins in linen, moistening their lips, clearing their airways when their breath rattled. But each measure was futile. They lived barely because neither could die without the other. Through 3 days and nights Brennan remained, recording their decline with meticulous notes. The stronger twin cried less often, exhaustion overcoming it, while the weaker seemed to slip further with each passing hour. Their shared chest labored under the weight of two bodies it could not sustain. At dawn on the 3rd day, the cries ceased. Their breathing faltered, then ended in unison, a silence as complete as it was final. The Donnellys received the death with the same stillness as they had the birth. Patrick murmured only that the line must endure, his tone not grief-stricken but resolute. Bridge folded the linen over the small bodies and set them aside with a gentleness that spoke of long practice, her face unreadable. For Brennan, the twins embodied the collapse of the family's experiment. 5 generations of inbreeding had not produced strength or purity, but children whose bodies betrayed the weight of accumulated error. In the conjoined twins, the Donnelly lineage had created a life so fragile it could not exist beyond 3 days. They were at once the most innocent of victims and the most damning of proofs. The house was quiet after their passing, but the silence felt more deliberate than natural, as though grief had been trained out of the bloodline. Brennan wrote in his journal that night, "Here ends not merely 2 lives, but the illusion of improvement. What they name purity is collapse." The parchment smelled of cattle barns, but its subject was human. Among the leather-bound journals hidden beneath the Donnelly cabin floorboards, Dr. Brennan found entries in an older hand, the ink faded to brown, the script archaic. These were the writings of Fergus Donnelly, great-grandfather of Patrick, composed in County Cork during the final decade of the 18th century. At first glance, the pages read like the notes of a farmer. They spoke of stock, breeding cycles, and the traits of calves and foals. But as Brennan read on, he realized the livestock in question were only a prelude. Fergus had transposed the principles of the barnyard onto his own household. The context was famine-haunted Ireland, a land where families struggled to survive on potatoes and thin broth, while landlords exported grain abroad. In such conditions, selective breeding of animals had become a point of fascination among progressive farmers. Superior lines of cattle, bred for milk or meat, promised resilience. Sheep bred for hardier wool offered profit even in lean years. Fergus, literate and ambitious, absorbed these theories with fervour, but unlike his neighbours, he did not stop at the barn. His journals record the first articulations of what he called a purified Irish blood. He wrote of centuries of British oppression as a corruption of the native stock, producing a people weakened by hunger and vice. Only through deliberate concentration of blood, he argued, could the Irish reclaim their strength. Cousin should be wed to cousin, he insisted, not to dilute but to refine. Traits of intelligence, height and beauty should be preserved as carefully as the markings of a prized stallion. Defects, whether physical deformity or what he termed moral weakness, were to be culled with the same finality a farmer applies to an unfit lamb. Scripture was twisted to provide sanction. Fergus cited genealogies of Genesis, where patriarchs married within their kin, where purity of blood was preserved in the chosen lines. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all, in his telling, practiced what he sought to justify. To him, biblical precedent made cousin marriage not only permissible, but ordained. The Lord shows us his design in the holy seed, one passage read, and it is not for man to scatter it amongst the unworthy. His words blurred the boundary between improvement and murder. In one chilling entry he wrote, "Better a child returned swiftly to God than its weakness carried into the line. Mercy lies not in life extended, but in life preserved strong for those yet to be born." Such phrases, cloaked in piety, masked the reality of infanticide. The doctrine he forged was not born of desperation, but of conviction. Brennan copied several of the anatomical sketches into his own notes. Drawings of infants, some whole, others distorted, were annotated with remarks of acceptance or rejection. A strong jaw was praised, a cleft palate condemned. Pale eyes were favoured, clubfoot was marked for release. The same cold shorthand used in animal breeding manuals had been applied to children of his own blood. What emerged from Fergus Donnelly's journals was not a theory half-formed, but a blueprint. His descendants carried it across decades and oceans, refining it until death itself became a form of inheritance. The graves in Montana, Brennan realized, were not anomalies. They were the inevitable harvest of seeds sown in Cork nearly a century before. The parchment smelled of barns because its author had confused the field with the family, and from that confusion had grown a doctrine strong enough to outlast famine, exile, and even oceans. In Fergus Donnelly's mind, the family line was not merely flesh and spirit. It was stock, to be bred, culled, and perfected, no matter the human cost. The frontier allowed many sins, but murder in rows of 11 was too much to ignore. By the late summer of 1876, Dr. Brennan had gathered enough evidence to act. The journals, the cemetery, the malformed births, all pointed not to misfortune but to system. He threatened Patrick Donnelly directly, his words deliberate, his tone measured. If the family continued their practices or attempted to conceal another death, he would ride to Helena and return with federal marshals. What might have been dismissed as tragedy within the isolation of one valley would, under scrutiny, be recorded as murder. The effect on the household was immediate. The composure that had long bound them together began to fracture. Patrick, once erect and calculating, faltered. His white hair seemed to age further within weeks, his shoulders stooping under the weight of exposure. His voice grew brittle, and one evening in the midst of argument, his words collapsed into silence as a stroke took him down. Brennan noted how he lay half paralyzed, one side of his body slack, his eye fixed on nothing. A man who had once spoken with the assurance of doctrine was reduced to stammered fragments, unable to defend the ideology that had consumed him. Bridge, who had lived so long under the burden of secrecy, unraveled more quickly. Her tremors worsened into fits. At times she whispered incessantly of infants buried. At others she withdrew into silence so complete it resembled catatonia. When federal custody finally removed her from the valley, she refused food, clutching her abdomen as if still carrying the pregnancies that had long defined her life. Within weeks, she was dead, the cause recorded as complications of female disorder, though Brennan suspected her body had simply surrendered under years of accumulated trauma. The children bore the collapse in different forms. Seamus, already crippled by a stutter, broke under questioning. When asked directly about the graves, he could not form words at all. His body convulsed with the effort of speech, and tears ran down his face as sound failed him. Authorities concluded he had suffered a complete nervous collapse, his mind unable to carry the dual weight of complicity and fear. Moira, withdrawn and heavy with the memory of her lost twins, moved like a figure in permanent mourning. She spoke in whispers, repeating lines from the journals, as though her father's doctrine had been burned too deeply into her to separate from her own thoughts. Colleen mirrored her sister's silence, her eyes dark with exhaustion, her body showing signs of early decline, though she was scarcely 16. Both young women seemed less like daughters than remnants of an experiment that had consumed them. Only Declan resisted the unravelling, though his resistance came in strange form. He oscillated between terror and defiance, at times muttering of graves and voices, at others staring with unsettling calm. Brennan suspected his deformities had spared him from being chosen for the continuation of the line, but at the cost of becoming its living reminder. His fate remained uncertain, and his disappearance from custody later would only deepen the mystery. The cabin itself stood hollow. With Patrick incapacitated and Bridge removed, its partitions and curtains revealed nothing but empty spaces, each one bearing the scent of secrecy. The small cemetery behind it became the truest record of their lives, a row of 11 graves, silent witnesses to the collapse of a family that had mistaken cruelty for preservation. The house of secrecy had fallen, its doctrine lay in fragments, its patriarch broken, its matriarch dead, its children shattered under truths too heavy to bear. Yet Brennan knew that exposure did not mean erasure. The graves remained, the journals remained, and the shadow of their practice stretched farther than one Montana valley. The crosses stand still, but the question remains, were they only one branch of many? When the Donnelly homestead was finally abandoned, the valley closed in around it. Snow reclaimed the roof, pressing against the timbers until boards buckled. Curtains rotted in place, walls sagged under their own weight. In spring, grass crept across the cabin's clearing, as if eager to erase the outlines of human presence. Yet one thing remained immune to the passing of seasons, the row of graves. 11 crosses stood in silence, their angles imperfect, but their arrangement unwavering. They marked not only the dead, but the system that had placed them there. Travellers who passed the site in later years described a palpable hush. Birds avoided the clearing, and even horses resisted stepping onto the disturbed soil. There was no inscription beyond dates, no names to tie the graves to memory. They were anonymous by design, as though the family intended to erase the very individuality of those they had culled. The row itself was the only confession. Dr. Brennan, long after leaving Montana, returned to the subject in his private journals. He documented every sketch, every genealogical chart, every detail of Fergus Donnelly's parchment doctrine. But he admitted to being haunted, not only by the children who had died, but by the suspicion that the Donnellys had never been alone. He traced scattered reports. A Donnelly family in Pennsylvania investigated for abnormal infant deaths. Another in Ohio noted for sudden disappearances. Immigration records, incomplete and contradictory, suggested parallel branches carrying the same forged stories, the same abrupt relocations, the same obsession with purity. In one entry dated 1892, Brennan wrote, "It is possible that Montana was not the end, but merely an outpost. If so, then the graves I counted were only a fraction of those unmarked, dispersed like seeds across the frontier." The possibility gnawed at him. He had seen enough to know that secrecy thrived where oversight faltered, and America's frontiers were vast. Each valley, each isolated homestead, each closed circle of kin might conceal a practice too methodical to dismiss as madness. And so the Donnelly graves became more than a local horror. They were a symbol, a suggestion that beneath the surface of settlement and progress lay remnants of older doctrines carried across oceans. Doctrines that confuse scripture with science, husbandry with humanity, purity with survival. The Montana Valley itself bore witness. Each winter sealed it in silence. Each thaw revealed again the mute testimony of crosses in a row. No trial was held, no marker set to explain. The land absorbed the evidence, but the evidence resisted burial. Today, no structure remains standing. The forest has claimed the clearing, the cabin reduced to scattered timbers. But beneath the soil lie bones too small to belong to adults, aligned with precision, preserved by cold. Their presence refuses to fade, for they do not signify misfortune. They signify intention. The graves are still there. They will always be there. The snow covers them, the grass conceals them, but their pattern remains. A record written not in ink, but in earth. And the question lingers, did the Donnellys die with Montana's silence? Or do other rows of small graves lie hidden in valleys where no one has yet looked?